Today we're looking at the question: was Jesus Christ a historical figure? If I mean it just almost goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, that if Jesus Christ was not a historical figure, then everything we're doing here is worthless, maybe even harmful. If Jesus Christ was not a historical figure, there was no resurrection, there was no crucifixion to lead to the resurrection, there were no miracles, there was none of this if Jesus Christ was not a historical figure. And yet, nowadays, we will hear people come out with the statement, with the allegation that Jesus Christ was just a myth or a legend or a fairy tale, and I don't believe that's what the evidence says. I believe there's historical evidence that Jesus Christ was a historical figure, and we're going to look at some of that evidence today. So is it possible, it gets right down to the question, is it possible that Jesus Christ is merely a legend, a myth, or a fairy tale? As I said already, if he is, or if he was, then we're not saved. There's no salvation in him any more than there would be through any other line. And yet D. James Kennedy, a man that I used to listen to regularly when he was alive, wrote a book called Why I Believe. And even though he's a very strong, passionate Christian, I don't think it was an overstatement when he wrote this, that the evidence for the historicity of Christ, and historicity is a big word, it just means that it is historical fact. The evidence for the historicity of Christ is so great, I know of no historian in the free world who would dare place his or her reputation on the chopping block by denying that Jesus Christ ever existed. Okay? And at first, that sounds like a pretty big statement. I mean, really, you're going to say nobody would put their reputation on the chopping block, and certainly there are some people out there who still try to make the case. But I think he makes a good point that very few people, even secular historians, will say that he didn't exist. Most historians will agree he did exist. Now, they stop short of where they need to be on that he was who he said he was. And I want to caution you as we go through some of this evidence today that we don't try to make the evidence say more than what it does. What I'm going to present to you today, I believe, demonstrates that Jesus Christ was a historical figure. Now, the fact that he was mentioned by these guys in historical record does not prove in and of itself that he was the Son of God. Now, I still believe that's the case, and I believe there's evidence from the Bible for that, but just these historical records don't prove that he was the Son of God. But if he didn't exist, he couldn't be the Son of God in the first place. So having this evidence that he existed is really the first step in proving that he was who he said he was. And before we go too much further, I want to give you a note about sources as well. As we look at this, a lot of the material comes from, I hope I say his name right, but Edwin Yamauchi. And he was, I think he's retired now, but he was a professor at Miami University in Ohio, and very well-respected scholar of the history of Christ, of the ancient documents, even among secular historians. The man was an evangelical Christian. Honestly, I don't know if he's still alive or not, but he was an evangelical Christian, and yet he was the go-to guy when people wanted to know about the ancient documents surrounding the time of Christ. They would go and talk to Edwin Yamauchi. But he says, the Gospels are excellent sources. As a matter of fact, they're the most trustworthy, complete, and reliable sources for Jesus. Doesn't it make you feel good to hear somebody in a university say that? For once, not running down the Gospels. They're the most trustworthy, complete, and reliable sources for Jesus. The incidental sources really don't add much detailed information. However, they are valuable as corroborative evidence. And what that means is we don't want to give the idea that we don't know enough about Jesus from the Gospels, or if we're looking at these outside sources, it means we don't think the Gospels are trustworthy. I believe, as hopefully I've presented to you the last few months that we've gone over this, I believe the Gospels are absolutely trustworthy. And so these sources aren't brought in because the Gospels aren't trustworthy, but they're brought in to give evidence to those who are still skeptical that there is good reason to believe the picture that the Gospels paint of Jesus Christ. It would be as though, say, I was on trial for murder. Say they were accusing me of murdering somebody in Tulsa. Now, and I say Tulsa for a reason, because there's a turnpike between here and there. And they had me on camera at the toll booth on the Cherokee Turnpike on the day in question. Now, me being on camera heading toward Tulsa right before the murder That would not prove in and of itself that I had murdered anybody when I was in Tulsa, but it's corroborative evidence saying, yes, he was on his way to Tulsa when that happened. It's kind of the same thing. In and of themselves, what we're going to talk about today doesn't prove who he was, but it backs up what the Gospels, which are the ultimate source, it backs up what the Gospels say about who he was. So we've got a few places where there's historical evidence for Christ outside the Gospels. If you remember back to last time, I talked about Josephus. His longer name is Titus Flavius Josephus, but we'll just call him Josephus today. He was a Jewish military commander in the latter half of the 1st century A.D. And what that means is between about 50 and 100 A.D., they had a lot of skirmishes between the Jews and the Romans because, as we know, during the time of Christ, the Romans were in charge of Judea, and the Jews didn't like it. There were the groups called the Zealots who tried to overthrow the Romans. That's what some of the people thought Jesus was there for, to set up an earthly kingdom and throw the Romans out. Well, Josephus was one of the Jewish military commanders. He ended up being defeated around AD 67, and after that he became a collaborator with the Romans. So he was not popular among his own people. He was kind of like Benedict Arnold, that, hey, once I don't get exactly where I need to be, I'm going to go over to the other side. And so he began to work with the Romans, and on their behalf, really, he wrote extensively on the history of the Eastern Mediterranean area. And so when it comes to the history of, say, Judea or Israel, Lebanon, Syria, that whole area, Josephus was the historian who wrote about that whole area of the world so the Romans would have a historical record of what had gone on. And it's important to note in this that Josephus was not a Christian. Okay? We will look at some Christian sources today because I don't think just because somebody's a Christian, they automatically become untrustworthy. Otherwise, I have no business being up here. But when it comes to the historical evidence for Jesus, if everything was written by Christians, well, then it might be suspect. But it makes a strong case that I think the skeptic can't really ignore when we have all this historical evidence, all this historical record of the existence of Christ, and it was written by non-Christian sources, people who had no reason to claim that he existed if he didn't. He wrote several things. One of them was the Antiquities of the Jews. And in the Antiquities of the Jews, he corroborates the fact that Jesus lived and ministered. So him writing about Jesus gives us a glimpse from a Jewish and Roman perspective, someone who was not a Christian, someone who rejected Christ as his Messiah, who still said, yes, this man existed and walked and ministered the way the Gospel said he did. And what's recorded today in the Antiquities of the Jews says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. Now I read this, and even as a Christian, even as someone who wants to make a case for the historical Jesus Christ, something about this is fishy to me. Because knowing what I know about Josephus was not a Christian. And for him to say Jesus is the Messiah and yet not accept him, when he says he's the Christ, he's saying he's the Messiah. And for a Jewish writer to say he's the Messiah, but then not be a Christian, makes no sense to me. For Josephus to admit the resurrection and not be a Christian makes no sense to me. And what has in all likelihood happened here is that some well-meaning but misguided Christian later on added some things to what Josephus wrote, okay, because it's just so glaring. Now, I still don't believe people added things to the Gospels later because everything seems to make sense where it goes. But it does not make sense to me that Josephus would say such high things, such wonderful things about Christ when he didn't accept him as the Messiah. And so there are even before I read that there was a controversy, I thought, there are some things that just don't belong in here. And I started making a list of crossing out things that I thought he probably wouldn't say. And as I've looked at both Christian and secular scholars, their lists are all pretty close together and pretty close together with my list. And I think we can, knowing about Josephus, we can piece together what he probably would have said. So a less controversial rendering of this passage, more in line with his own rejection of Christ, might read, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man. He was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. And you may say, Brother Jared, you're taking out the resurrection, you're taking out the miracles, you're taking out this and that. No, folks, my belief in the miracles, my belief in the resurrection is not dependent on Josephus. My belief in the resurrection and the miracles and everything else that Jesus did that proved he was the Son of God is dependent on what the Bible tells me. But we can look at this and make a reasonable conclusion about what Josephus, as a non-believing historian, could have said. And it doesn't indicate here that Josephus believes he's the Son of God, but it still confirms that Jesus Christ existed, that he had a following, that he was crucified, all of these things in line with what the Gospels say about him. Just the very fact that he's mentioned here by a historian within about 30 years of when he would have lived is some of the best evidence we have for the fact that he lived and existed at the time that the Gospels said he did. And even though that in and of itself, as I've said, does not prove he's the Son of God, it begins to make the case, because if he doesn't exist, he can't be the Son of God. And yet the evidence shows he did exist. He also wrote in Antiquities, and all of this sort of indirectly contributes to corroborating what the Gospels say, because it talks about other people who were involved in the Gospels, other people who were involved in the ministry of Jesus Christ. He corroborates the ministry of John the Baptist, who we know was the forerunner of Christ. And he wrote, "Now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against John that was called the Baptist." So when Herod's army was destroyed, some of the Jews in their day thought it was because of what he did to John the Baptist. Well, that can't be true if there was no John the Baptist, but there was a John the Baptist. "For Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness toward one another, and piety toward God, and so to come to baptism." Okay? So he confirms the ministry that the Gospels tell us that John the Baptist had as a forerunner and as someone who would point the Jews to Jesus Christ. In this same book, he talks about James, who we know from the New Testament to be the brother of Jesus, and also the fact that early on they believed that he was the Son of God. And this goes to disprove the idea that people will say, oh, when people started to believe he was the Son of God, that was just a belief they invented much, much later. For Josephus to say this within 30 years is to demonstrate that very early on, the people who knew him best said, yes, this man is the Son of God. He writes, "Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So Annas assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and brought before them the brother of Christ, who was brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others." So he affirms there again Christ. He affirms the existence of James and the fact that they followed him. "And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." And so he affirms the fact that James was there, and James followed him, that James followed Jesus Christ, and so many others did as well. And we know that the reason they followed Jesus Christ is not just that he was a good teacher. There are lots of good teachers, but if they'd been killed on the cross, I mean, that's kind of humiliating to follow a man who got himself killed in the most horrifying and humiliating, demeaning way in their view. There was something else. They believed he was the Son of God and that he was risen again. Now we move on from Josephus, in case you were tired of looking at him. Tacitus, Publius Cornelius Tacitus, I believe his name is. He's a member of the Roman Senate, so he was one of the Roman elites. He wrote very extensively on the history of the Roman Empire, so much so that he was considered to be the greatest of all Roman historians. This is not just some obscure historian writing about obscure things. This was the man to go to for a record of what happened during the Roman times. He was also not a Christian. As a Roman, he was a follower of the Roman pagan philosophies. He wrote books called a collection of works called the Annals. I believe the long term of it is the Annals of Imperial Rome, but I'm not absolutely certain of that. In this, he corroborates the existence of Christ, the historical fact of his crucifixion, and the fact that very early on people believed in his resurrection. He wrote in the Annals, "Hence to suppress the rumor." Now this, when he says the rumor, it was the rumor that Jesus Christ was alive again. He refers to the rumor. Another man later on refers to a mischievous superstition. They're talking about belief in the resurrection. "Hence to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with guilt and punished with the most exquisite tortures the persons commonly called Christians." He's speaking of the emperor here. The persons commonly called Christians who were hated for their enormities. So in order to bring to an end this superstitious, scary idea that Jesus Christ was alive again, The Roman emperor falsely charged Christians of crimes, punished them with, even Tacitus, who was not a Christian, looks at the torture and says this was gruesome stuff. He calls it the most exquisite tortures and says that these people were hated for their enormities. The churches were growing. They were multiplying. Christus, the founder of that name, was put to death as a criminal by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but also through the city of Rome also, whither all things horrible and disgraceful flow. Speaking about his own city here, by the way, calls Rome a cesspool, basically, of all the worst ideas in the world. From all quarters as to a common receptacle, and where they are encouraged. Accordingly, first those were seized who confessed they were Christians. Next, on their information, a vast multitude were convicted, not so much on the charge of burning the city as of hating the human race. And so they accused them of everything that they could, these Christians, even accused them of basically crimes against humanity for believing in the resurrection. And Nero tried everything he could do to stamp out this pernicious superstition, this rumor of the resurrection. But it's hard to stamp out the truth. And so it seems like it's stamped out and then it just broke out again. And Tacitus writes not that it was a rumor that Jesus Christ existed and was crucified under Pilate. He writes that as fact. He said Christ existed, he ministered in Judea, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and then they believed in the resurrection. So we have very early Tacitus saying Jesus was real, he was a historical figure, he really died the way the Gospels say he died, and people, for some reason, believed he rose from the dead. And as we go further in this series of studies, I believe they were absolutely right, and there's no reasonable explanation for their belief other than the fact that he really did rise from the dead. We move on to Pliny the Younger. There was also Pliny the Elder, who was apparently even more famous, but we're not going to talk about him today. Pliny the Younger was a Roman historian. He was at one point the imperial governor of Bithynia and Pontus over in modern-day Turkey. So he was a high-ranking official in the Roman Empire, very important man. He was a witness to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii, and he wrote about it. And so this gives you some indication of him as a historian. A great deal of our understanding, I think, of what happened there comes from him. He was also not a Christian. He had no reason to confirm anything about Christ if it had not been true. In his writings, he affirmed that early Christians worshipped Christ, believed in the resurrection, and followed his teachings. And he writes of them. And what we have of his, we don't have a collection of historical works like the Annals or the Antiquities of the Jews. What we have is a collection of letters that he exchanged with the Emperor Trajan. So this man is writing back and forth to the emperor and telling him what has gone on. That gives you some indication of the credibility with which the Roman government held him. The Christians had been in the habit of meeting together on a stated day before sunrise and of offering in turns a form of invocation to Christ as to a god. Okay? They were already meeting together on a certain day of the week. They were offering up prayers to Christ as though he were a god. Well, that's because they believed he was the Son of God and rose again from the dead. And by the way, how'd you like to... we talk a lot about doing what the apostles did and doing what they did early on. How would you like to have church before sunrise? There's some traditions we can be okay with letting go, I guess. So they would come together and offer a form of invocation to Christ as to a god. Also of binding themselves by an oath, not for any guilty purpose. And then he goes on in the letter to state, it wasn't for thievery, it wasn't for drunkenness, I can't remember what all he names, but he lists he names a list of all these things that they're not swearing an oath together to do. And I thought, well, just saying it's not for any guilty purpose pretty well covers it. This wasn't a secret society where they were conspiring and saying we're going to swear an oath to one another, and kind of like the Masons, we'll cut our tongues out and bury it at high tide or whatever it is they say. He said they were swearing together an oath and not for any guilty purpose. Folks, they were encouraging one another to continue in the faith, I believe is probably the oath they were swearing, that they would live for Christ, that they would die for Christ. And I find it interesting, he doesn't question the existence of Christ. He admits that Christ was a historical figure. What he can't figure out is that they were offering up invocations. They were offering up prayers to him as though he were some kind of God. Well, good reason for that. But we see from what he writes that yes, they accepted even in that early day that Christ was a real historical figure, and that it's recorded that even in the earliest days people were already worshiping him as a God. Then there's a man named Thallus. And Thallus, his writings, he's a Samaritan historian in the first century. His writings are pretty much lost to us. We don't have any copies of his writings. The only things, as far as I recall, that we know about Thallus are where he was quoted, a century or two later by other writers. And so his writings since have disappeared, and what we have are quotes of him from other writers. But through these quotes, we can see that he affirms that there was a midday darkness at the time of Christ's crucifixion. I don't care what modern day people tell us, oh, that was a fairy tale. The people who knew what happened said there was darkness at midday, just like the Gospels tell us. Now, he incorrectly assumes that it was a solar eclipse. Now, Thallus was not a Christian. He said, yes, there was this darkness that they talk about when Jesus was crucified. There was this darkness across the land, but it was a solar eclipse. Now, there's a problem with that, as I've been told that solar eclipses, I'm not an expert in astronomy or astrology, either one, but people who know have told me, people I've read who would know, say that a solar eclipse, for whatever reason, cannot appear during the time of Passover, because something about the position of the moon, I think, cannot appear at the time of Passover. And we know that Christ was crucified around the time of Passover. And some have said, well, maybe it was a lunar eclipse, but the problem is a lunar eclipse cannot appear at midday. Now, again, I don't completely understand why that is. I probably could have told you when I was in 4th grade and we studied the moon and studied the eclipses and stuff, but I've forgotten a lot about that. So he admits there was darkness and tries to explain it away, but he fails. And the explanation is God darkened the skies, I believe. We have other historical evidence outside the Gospels, this one from a Christian source. Again, we don't, just for the skeptic, we don't want to build our entire case on the Apostle Paul, but there's no reason to believe he's not credible either. The Apostle Paul, his letters predate the Gospels. Now, because they are first in our New Testament, we tend to think that, and they cover a period of time that was earlier, we tend to think that the Gospels were written earlier. The fact is, some of Paul's writings were some of the earliest written parts of the New Testament. I think maybe only the book of James predates Paul's writings. And I want to say the book of Galatians may have been written as early as the late 40s AD. So that would be less than 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion and ascension. So they actually predate the Gospels. And what's important about that is that the details in Paul's writings, when they mention the life of Christ, they corroborate everything the Gospels tell us. They back up everything the Gospels tell us about the life of Christ. They back up things such as the deity of Christ. We've talked about, could they have later on invented the idea that he was a god? Well, we've seen already that some of these early Roman and Jewish historians look on in just utter amazement and disbelief that these people would worship Jesus as a god. So obviously, from that we can conclude it wasn't a 2nd century or 3rd century invention that he was God. John didn't come up with a higher Christology, as they call it, a higher view of Christ later on. But Paul's letters even predate the writings of the gospel. And you can't get a higher Christology, you can't get a higher view of Christ just about than what we see in Colossians, calling him the image of the invisible God. It confirms that early on, maybe even before the Gospels were written, Christians believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. Paul very clearly believes that Jesus was crucified. In one of the passages I quote most often here lately, in 1 Corinthians 15, he says that the essential parts of the gospel are that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried and he rose again the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. He says, I'm crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. You cannot read Paul's letters without getting a belief in the crucifixion, and they predate the crucifixion stories in the Gospels. They confirm his burial, that he was buried in a borrowed tomb. They confirm his resurrection, that he rose again. That wasn't something people just made up 300 years later. The earliest Christians believed that he rose again because the earliest Christians are the ones who either saw it for themselves or knew the people who had. So about Paul's letters, also people will say, well, even though it was written earlier, he could have just made all this stuff up. Folks, as we discussed Sunday night, the Apostle Paul had there's no reasonable motive for his conversion. There's no reasonable motive for his writings, for his profession of faith, other than a real experience of seeing Jesus Christ in resurrected form. Because Paul didn't become wealthy, Paul didn't become privileged, Paul didn't become popular or powerful or anything else. Paul suffered for the rest of his life. He could have gone on in a very good position as far as the local Pharisees were concerned. He could have gone on in reasonable comfort the rest of his life, but he threw everything away because of the experience with Jesus Christ on the Damascus Road. There's no reason that I can see to conclude that the Apostle Paul made any of this up. And as I said, his details even predate what the Gospels say. Then we're getting to the end here. We've got some of the apostolic fathers. That they're in quotation marks because that's what other people call them. They were disciples of the original disciples. Polycarp of Smyrna was a follower of the Apostle John, and so on. And I caution people about reading the men who came after the apostles, because some of them within a generation or two were well on their way to formulating Roman Catholic teachings, and even in the times of the apostles, they were writing in the New Testament, warning about some of the heresies that were already creeping into the churches. So you get far removed, before you get too far removed from the apostles, you start running into problems in theology. But as far as their historical writing, we can look at some of the things that they wrote. And speaking about the apostolic fathers, so these were the people that were trained by Peter and James and John and Matthew and so on. Speaking of these apostolic fathers like Polycarp of Smyrna, Clement of Rome, and Ignatius of Antioch, Edwin Yamauchi says, in many places these writings attest to the basic facts about Jesus, particularly his teachings, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and his divine nature. So very early on, the Christians were writing extensively that this is what happened, and I know the people who saw it happen. Now, we probably could come up with more references, but that's, as far as I have seen and as far as I know, that's the bulk of early references to Jesus, which could lead us to the question, why are there not more? Shouldn't we expect a figure of such historical importance as Jesus? Shouldn't we expect a historical figure with that importance to have more of a historical record? Shouldn't more people have written about him? Shouldn't more people have told about the things that he did? Well, first of all, we don't know that they didn't. A lot of ancient writings have been lost to time. But as far as what we have, it's sounding so small because it's been relatively short compared to some of the other talks I've given in this series. Relatively short bit of information we have here. Consider that the earliest records of Muhammad's life date from more than 100 years after he died. Okay? We've got some records, well, we'll get to that in just a second. Accounts that were written within his lifetime are very scarce, and yet historians don't really doubt much about what people say about Muhammad. There's another prophet, you may never have heard of him, or called a prophet, named Zoroaster. He's the forerunner of the Zoroastrian religion, which was the religion of the ancient Persian Empire, and there are still people called Parsis today in parts of Iran and other areas who practice this religion. The earliest records we have of Zoroaster's life are from more than 1,300 years after his death, and yet there's very little about his life about the records of his life that historians doubt the accuracy of. In contrast to this 1,300 and this 100, and we could look at others, records of Buddha's life and records of people in Hinduism where we don't even know who founded their religion, and there's a mix between history and mythology in some of their people's records. In contrast to all of this, we've seen today that the earliest record of Jesus' life is written within 20 years. The earliest records we have of Jesus' life are written within 20 years of the fact. Now, there might have been a lot of people who'd been eyewitness to these things who would have died, but certainly 20 years later there were people still around who had been eyewitness to the events. They couldn't have gotten away with the lie if it hadn't been true. And even these secular historians readily admit, the Jewish historians, the Roman historians, who hated the Christians, who hated Christ, who hated this whole pernicious superstition and these rumors that they talked about, admitted that the man really existed and walked the streets and roads and hills and valleys of Judah in the first century. The fact that he existed is one of the best attested facts in all of history. And Yamauchi says we have better historical documentation for Jesus than for the founder of any other ancient religion. If we begin to doubt the existence of Jesus as a historical figure, there aren't many people from ancient history we can look at with certainty about their existence either. And I remembered several verses that John wrote, and this one came to mind, where he wrote several passages along these same lines, but in 2 John verse 7, he said, "For many deceivers are entered into the world who confess not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist." Even in their day, they were facing what they called the Gnostics, who said, yeah, he came and he was just a spirit, not a real figure, because they believed, told you before about the Gnostics, they had two main tenets to their faith, two main principles to their beliefs. They believed in secret knowledge that would lead you to spiritual truth that not everybody would be privy to. And they also believed, I think that the most important of these hidden truths was that the material physical world was all evil, and the spiritual world, the immaterial, was good, and that Jesus Christ, being a perfect being, could not have come in physical form. Now, you see the problem with that. If he was not a historical flesh and blood figure, he could not have died for our sins. If he was a myth, if he was a fairy tale, if he was just a spirit or a hologram, we are still dead in our sins. And yet that's a lie from the Antichrist, the Bible says. Because I believe Jesus Christ really did come in the flesh. He really did have that flesh pierced on the cross. And every drop of blood he shed was for my sins and yours. And we can rest confident in the knowledge that our Savior was a historical figure. And as we go further with this series of studies, we'll see that there's even more evidence that he is exactly who the Gospels say he is, and that he's the unique Son of God and the Savior of mankind.